point of all of this, though, is not to persuade anyone to believe the Kremlin's account. It's to persuade you not to believe anything. It's to persuade you that all politicians are liars, that there is no such thing as objective truth, and therefore not to see what is right in front of your nose.
The Ecuadorian dart frog is disinformation, according to the Kremlin. That's the response to the statement from the UK and other European governments about the death of Alexei Navalny. They're determined he was killed by an exotic poison while held in a remote Russian penal colony. But now we know this. What difference does it make to what the UK and allies do next? Sir Laurie Bristow, as former UK ambassador to Russia, was in Moscow in the wake of the Salisbury poisonings in 2018, and very pleased to say that he's with us now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
First of all, your instant reaction to this kind of exotic, bespoke, kind of bizarre, I think one word we heard from an expert earlier on, kind of method of killing the Ecuadorian dart frog, the venom from that. Are you surprised?
Well, in a way, no. I think this particular method for killing Alexei Navalny is not one I've heard of before. But I think you just need to look back at some of the other ways in which the Russian state has killed its enemies and its opponents over the years. So as you say, I was the ambassador in Moscow at the time of the attempt to kill Sergei Skripal in Salisbury using a Novichok nerve agent. Of course, the Russian state tried to use a similar Novichok nerve agent to kill Alexei Navalny in 2020 by the, as it turned out, rather strange method of painting it on his underpants while he was on an internal flight in Russia. But also going back before that, the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in London in 2006, they did that with polonium-210, a very, very rare, unusual radioactive agent. I think the underlying point here, though, is, first of all, the Russian state, like the Soviet state, had and has these programs, for eliminating dissidents and opponents. But I think what also the method tells us is something about the mindset of those people. It's highly conspiratorial. It's dependent on what I call implausible deniability. It might come out, it might not. But if the story does come out, the message will be lost on nobody. But also it gives the Kremlin the opportunity to say that, this isn't so. This is just disinformation.
And is there anything we can do about this? The world sort of drew attention to this yesterday. We've all been poring over the details. It is very John le Carré-esque, the whole story behind it. But what follows, if anything, from this discovery?
Well, I think there are some things that the UK and the other 4 European countries, others who are interested in this, could do. One, of course, is just to make the information public, which has now been done. I would be surprised if Andrei Kelin, the ambassador in London, who I know very well, isn't called in to explain himself sometime soon. His answer will be, it isn't us, it isn't so, show us the evidence. These are all the standard propaganda techniques that the Kremlin uses.
Because you summoned him, did you, over the Salisbury...
Well, I was in Moscow at the time. I was being summoned by the Russian state in the other way round to explain what we were doing. But the big picture here, of course, is that the news has come out at the Munich Security Conference, so the big annual gathering of heads of state, defence ministers, foreign ministers, and so on. And it's 2 years almost to the day since the news of Navalny's murder broke. And I think there are two things going on there that are important. One, of course, is the forthcoming round, the next round of US, Russia, Ukrainian potential peace negotiations this week. And the key point there is that Russia is still doing exactly what it set out to do in Ukraine. And I think it's important to underline what actually is at stake here. The second is the ongoing discussion between the Europeans, the UK and the Americans about the future defence relationship between Europe and the United States within NATO. And the point there is just to get across very clearly the size of the issues that we're dealing with regard to the Kremlin.
So it's almost like trying to sort of point out to Donald Trump and everyone else around him that, the menace of Putin and Russia, I guess. And yet the signs are that, if anything, Putin is exerting more influence over Donald Trump, and Donald Trump is using the leverage he has over Zelensky to try and force him, to concede what he's fought and his people have fought very hard not to concede over the last 4 years.
Yeah, so on the first of those points, of course, that's why Navalny was imprisoned, and the Kremlin made numerous attempts to kill him. It was precisely to suppress the effectiveness with which he was exposing the corruption and the extreme violence and lawlessness inside Russia as a result of Mr. Putin's rule. On the ceasefire negotiations, look, I mean, the stakes this week are exactly the same as they have been for some time now. It's not difficult to work out what the elements of a ceasefire are. There's an element in there of what happens about land. An enormous element is about security guarantees. The heart of this, though, is what happens after a ceasefire. The problem with agreeing a ceasefire with Mr. Putin is it doesn't change Mr. Putin's view of Russia or Ukraine or us or the world. So we can absolutely guarantee that his objectives with regard to Ukraine will not change. If there's a ceasefire, we can expect him to continue to try and pursue those objectives. What we must not do as the West is give him for free or for minor concessions in a negotiation what he hasn't achieved in 4 years on the battlefield.
Earlier this morning, we were discussing polling about President Zelensky in Ukraine, suggesting if he was forced, and he's certainly being encouraged to hold an election now, he would win it. If he concedes, to a peace deal along the lines that are being discussed at the moment, he's unlikely to win an election after that. What do you make of that kind of polling, and how important is it to Putin, do you think, that whatever else happens, that the end of the war would be the end as a politician of President Zelensky?
Well, the big difference, I think, between Ukraine and Russia here is that people are even discussing the prospect of asking Ukrainians what they actually want. Do they want Mr. Zelensky as president? Do they want a settlement of some sort with Russia? Do they want to fight on? There's no question of asking Russians that question. That's not how Russia works.
I did say final, but one more on disinformation, because that's what the Kremlin's accusing us of. They know the meaning of that word. What will they be doing at the moment to try and undermine what we have just unleashed now? You've seen that up close over the years. What will they do to try and question the account that we have?
Well, I hesitate to recommend to anyone that they spend time on social media on this, but if you look at the social media coverage overnight and the extensive use of bots and trolls and useful idiots and all the rest of it, you can see this playing out in real time. So the elements, as we discussed earlier, one of them will be show us the evidence. The purpose, of course, of that isn't to show the Kremlin or to demand that we show the Kremlin the evidence. It's to undermine the evidence. This is exactly what the Kremlin did to us in 2018 over the Skripal poisoning. It's exactly, by the way, what they did with the shoot down of the MH17 flight over Ukraine in 2014. There'll be a lot of whataboutism in there. You do nothing, you'll know better, you do other things. The point of all of this, though, is not to persuade anyone to believe the Kremlin's account. It's to persuade you not to believe anything. It's to persuade you that all politicians are liars, that there is no such thing as objective truth, and therefore not to see what is right in front of your nose.
Thank you very much, Sir Laurie, for that incisive view, if ultimately at the end rather depressing. Thank you very much indeed.